So thinking with timely topics, we hear about wildfires.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is work that comes out of actually 2 papers. So the empirical results I'm going to show you are on the topic of wildfire, but with a bunch of collaborators who I thought I should just write down all their names right away. We're thinking about kind of this more broadly applied to questions of adaptation to climate change in general. And so we're thinking about examples like flood. So these are Hurricane Harvey folks standing in their garage, flooded. We're thinking about it in the context of wildfire, and that's most of what I'll focus on today. And we're thinking about it actually also in the context of vector-borne, zoonotic diseases, as they're called. And so the question is really, what do humans do to respond to climate-driven events in ways that might affect both the natural system and then come back to potentially fight them in the end. And that's kind of the potential maladaptation that I'm going to talk about. And humans do a lot of different things, right, to respond to these events. So some of them are great. I just read that flood insurance purchases have spiked after Harvey. That's probably a pretty good adaptive mechanism. You're insuring yourself against floods later. Others of them are more questionable, and these are going to be some of the ones we're talking about. But for example, this summer, Cedar Falls approved some flood levy plans in direct response to having had a flood 2 years before that. And that's good in many ways, right? It protects the town of Cedar Falls from that flooding. But what we know about flooding is that if you move the flood from up here, you typically move it to down there, right? So it has consequences elsewhere. Similarly, Zika comes around in the Florida Keys. They're going to release some genetically engineered mosquitoes who can't breathe, basically. And there's some question as to what the unintended consequences of that might be. And then in the wildfire case, there's a headline in my home state of Montana where there's a fire burning near Lincoln saying, look, we were going to do something about fire in this area that's now burning, but we didn't because there's a lawsuit, and now you have this coalition of groups and individuals who are all mobilized to do something. And that's fundamentally what I'm going to try to argue happens pretty frequently after these kinds of events. And what we're going to do is I'm going to call that salience, and argue that this sort of like, well, now we're mobilized, effect shows up over and over again and has big consequences. And then in fact, it's what links often the natural system to the human system in a lot of these sort of climate-driven systems. So if we start from the natural system and think about it producing some sort of an event, a fire, a flood, whatever, which of course also affects the natural system. And my natural science colleagues get really mad when I leave out that the loop back. But that natural event actually has an effect on the human system, which may drive what we're looking at here, which is a salience response. And what do I mean by that? I mean that because you've just seen a wildfire or a flood, all of a sudden that's what's foremost in your mind, right? You're suddenly worried about wildfire, not whatever you were worried about yesterday, like what your kids were having for lunch or whatever. And so you're paying attention to it, and that might be good. You might adapt in ways that are really positive. You might reduce your vulnerability, for example. So in the case of wildfires, you might decide to make some investments in defensible space around your house. You might retrofit your roof to not be flammable anymore. These are all good things we can do to adapt to climate change. Or you might actually try and reduce your hazard. So you might try to prevent or reduce the severity of future events, and so it's a lot of what we saw in those headlines. But I'm going to argue that sometimes what we do here, as a result of salience, actually has the potential to make the consequences actually worse. And so I will look at this in the context of wildfire for the next few minutes, and then we can kind of return to thinking about adaptation more broadly at the very end. And the big question we have here is, does the salience of wildfire risk for the public, among the public, influence the timing and location of fuels management projects? I'll show you a picture of one in a second, by federal agencies. So is the process that's going on one that looks like, oh, something happens, I start paying attention, I demand something from the federal agencies, and they respond to my demands. And our hypothesis here that we're directly testing is that recent and close wildfires, so if it happens close to me, is going to drive that attention to fire management. We have a little bit of indirect evidence that this happens at the individual level, and lead to demands for fuels treatments. And so is that what sort of characterizes this system? And I'll talk in a moment about what the consequences are of that. This is an example of fuels treatment, if you're not familiar with this area. There are two things that we do to reduce the severity of future fires. One is we do prescribed burns, which tend to be pretty unpopular, but we do them, and they're in this data. And the other is we do thinning operations with pellet olive and burn it typically, so it's pretty common. And that's actually going to be what I'm trying to understand. I'm going to be trying to understand the distribution of these actions that the government takes, right, to try to reduce the severity of wildfire. And to orient you to kind of our empirical strategy, I want you to think about the Western United States. We have data on the entire Western United States, which is, as many of you know, composed of a lot of public lands and then private lands. We take that Western United States, we chop it up into like 1.6 million little 1 kilometer squares. So think about chopping it all up into these little tiny squares. And then we ask the question of, is it true that a square that's close to people who've experienced a fire is more likely to get this kind of government intervention, right? Get this response. And so we measure all those distances, just thinking about how far is this grid cell from people and how far is a fire from people. To give away the big finding, what we find is that, let me see if I can make that picture go away. Sorry. Is that, so I think the best way to think about this sort of econometrically, or sort of think about the statistics of this, is we're trying our best to compare this situation to this situation, right? We're trying to sort of do our best to act like the fire is almost an experimental treatment, right? Either you've experienced a fire or you haven't experienced a fire. We're trying to hold everything else that we can constant. And we do that in a lot of ways. The primary way, for those of you who are interested, is like all sorts of fixed effects by all sorts of different geographic areas. Okay, so that's the idea. I will give away the punchline and tell you that, in fact, the baseline level of like likelihood that you're going to get a fuels treatment is 0.4%. So like 0.4% of these cells get fuels treatments across the United States, which, by the way, people who study fire say is way too low to not end up having this kind of day for a long time in the future, given what we've kind of done for fires management. What we find is that if there's been a fire, and it's about 1.6 percentage points higher. So, that's 4 times the baseline that it gets increased. So it's a pretty big effect relative to the baseline rate. And so, in fact, we do see that this happens where there are fires. To walk you through it, let me show you actually just data. This is not even the model, although I can show that to you if you want to see it later. But I want to walk you through these sort of 2 things that I think demonstrate what's going on in the salience effect. So on the left-hand side, you have the distance of the people to the public lands on the x-axis, and the relative frequency of fuels reductions in the sort of within 3 years. And what we see is that as you get further from people, right, the likelihood of a fuels treatment goes down. And that the high salience case, the case where there's been a fire, is a little bit higher, but not statistically different in this just bin scatter plot of the data points. But this, I think, gives you the intuition that as those fires get further away, they have less effect. And then on the right-hand side, instead of having distance on the x-axis, you'll see years on the x-axis. And what we see in that is that as you get further from having had a fire, right, the places that have had a fire start to look a lot more like the places that never had a fire. So we take this to be evidence that in fact what is going on is that I see a fire, I freak out, call my member of Congress, I call the Forest Service, and they actually respond. We're in the process of coupling this with an ecological model to be able to say exactly what the consequences of this are, to actually quantify the consequences in terms of carbon, water, all the things we might care about. I want to give you, I want to try and convince you of a couple of additional things about this. One is, I don't think this is a learning effect. So I don't think it's the case that fire managers see a fire and go, oh crap, it's really bad out there, for a couple reasons. One, they already knew it was bad. That's pretty implausible, I think, on its face, but okay, maybe. The second reason is that when we interact this with some measures of how bad it is out there, we see no effect, right? It's not different. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing that I think convinces me that this is a story about like learning, or about people, not about managers learning about objective risk, is that we see a little bit of politics in the story. So we see that in places that have committee members who sit on the appropriations of the oversight committee, who can kind of oversee this process of distributing the fuels treatments, there's a little bit more of a bump. So this is an interaction, so that the salience happens more there. And then the last thing I want to convince you of, and this relates to, I guess, all of the talks that we just heard, is that there's another big implication of this, that if it holds across a lot of adaptation, I think is even more problematic. And that is that we see quite a bit of inequality in the process. So again, this is an interaction term, but what it just shows is that where there are more housing units, we're more likely to see this salience effect happening. Okay, that probably makes sense. There's more people there to argue for this. There's more sort of assets at risk. But we also see that the effect is greater where people are wealthier and where people have more education, right? Which are exactly the same people who participate more in the political process. But I think it's probably exacerbating what was, an already sort of unequal situation, because basically they're the folks who are able to demand the resources from the government, and then they get them. So we get more than a doubling of the likelihood of treatment when it's near people who have experienced a fire. But I think there are two big consequences. One is that what I just said about the inequitable nature of this phenomenon, if this is really how we're making decisions about the distribution of resources in adapting to these consequences of climate change, then that seems very problematic to me. And then the second point I want to make, and that I'll wrap up on the next slide with, try and make it under our time limit, is that I'm not sure this is really improving resilience, right? If we think back to that slide where the fire has occurred in one place and not occurred in the other place, the place where the fire occurred actually just had a big fuels treatment, right? If anything, right, if this is when a fire occurred, their risk just actually went down, right? Because a bunch of stuff burned. There's less to burn. There's fewer places to have an ignition. There's a big fuel break that was the fire. But salience goes up and activity goes up in that same place, right? And so there's a really big mismatch, both in terms of time and in terms of distance. So the time thing, I think, that's sort of at a place. But this also has really big consequences in terms of, again, where we're allocating these things, right? So now we're putting these treatments where they're not necessarily needed, which means they're not going in the places that probably do need them, which then feeds into this natural system, right, that's producing these climate change impacts that we're trying to figure out how to adapt to. And so I think that this is incredibly problematic from the perspective of sort of government and individual responses to the things that are happening under climate change. So if we think about this in terms of floods, when we put resources towards the places that just had a flood, we're exacerbating in other places. When we put resources towards the places that just had a fire, we're actually exacerbating the potential in the other places, which is exactly, I think, the opposite of what we would sort of want a government that's thinking about distributing common resources, our tax dollars, essentially, to be doing. With that, I caught us up. Talked fast. But also I'd be really happy to take questions about, and especially about sort of, I'm interested in what these psychologists think about the kind of individual level phenomenon that's going on, but we'll go back there. That's okay. So am I, so that's.
Did you account for where the government officials live? Because you're talking about wealthier neighborhoods, you're talking about more educated neighborhoods. Is there a possibility that you're seeing some sort of effect also because they're thinking about their neighborhood?
Yeah, so there's actually, it's fun to study the Forest Service because there's this history in political science of studying the Forest Service. So there's a really famous book really famous. It's called The Forest Ranger, and I loved it. I'm sure not everybody loved it. It's probably not famous among all groups, but I love it. That looks at the Forest Service, and it leads me to not be super worried about that because the big upshot of it is that these really geographically distributed bureaucracies have often been designed with just that problem in mind, essentially designed to not let the agents go native, right? And so the Forest Service, for example, moves people a lot, actually. Like you get an appointment over here, and then you get an appointment over there, and then you gotta go to DC for a little while because you gotta get, socialized into their culture. So I'm not super worried about that, although it is the case that in that moment, and this is a fairly short-term phenomenon, it is the case that they are probably living near that place. Not at the sort of really tiny scale that we're talking about, but it's that could be happening. Yes.
So maybe this is a two-pronged question. So how should you think about how to allocate the fire mitigation? Is the first part, and it's a related but also very different prong. What about floods, where the argument that there's just been a flood and so now your risk is mitigated doesn't quite hold?
Doesn't quite apply.
Right, so Houston is not less at risk of flooding.
Yeah, so floods is a little harder case. So the question of how you think you should allocate these, right? So this is an answer that's really dissatisfying to political scientists because then our answer is always, but there's always politics. But I mean, you could think about allocating these on the basis of objective risk, right? There's no, when we think about, and as political scientists, when we think about bureaucracies, they're sort of exactly designed, right, to be technical experts who can sort of, who can apply some sort of, more objective assessment in distributing resources. So in theory, you could imagine saying, we're just going to make a big list of places with values at risk and that look terrible in terms of fire risk, and we're going to put, we're just going to go down the list, right? You can imagine doing that. The political scientist in me says, yeah, right. I mean, that's not.
But doesn't that predict the same interaction with wealth and education? That is, if you said, let's protect the places where there's the most kind of value and human capital.
Yeah, so this is tricky. We've been thinking a lot about untangling values at risk, right? So you might think it makes sense to do more of this where there's just more, more houses at risk, right? And we see that from the kind of income effect, which is, there's just as much value, but these people are richer, right? Imagine a sparser neighborhood, right? So there's as much value at risk. And so we try to do that a little bit with the kind of housing versus income measure, but I'd be interested in thinking more, and I actually have been working with a graduate student who's been trying to think better about disentangling those effects, right? Value versus income. And it's a little tricky because they often run together. And I forgot.
Floods.
Oh, floods, sorry. So, really good question, right? I don't think we can yet make a strong claim that we're making a perverse decision necessarily in flooding in a given location, but we often are making a perverse decision. There's pretty good literature to show it across locations by putting levees where they're put, right? And so it's but there's pretty good evidence that putting levees in some of the places we put them has exacerbated downstream flooding, right? And so, it's a question of trade-offs, right? Which is exactly what, you know, these agencies are sort of designed to try to think about, or whatever, designed to distribute these resources. So it's a little bit trickier case, but I still think there's a case to be made that just this reactive sort of put it where there's been a problem doesn't account for what problems that creates elsewhere. Who, by the way, the elsewhere people might not be paying attention, right? Because they might not have gotten flooded exactly because you did get flooded, right? So we can't really rely on this like salience mechanism to get them also riled up necessarily, right? And so I think we still end up with like a maldistribution across a system or across distance or across, you know, location.
I'm curious, you alluded to this a little bit at the beginning, but often fuels management projects are held up during the NEPA process by lawsuits, primarily from environmental organizations all the time. And so in some of your work, have you seen Salience sort of acting on those actors in terms of them dropping suits and projects just getting pushed through because there's now more political capital?
Yeah, so I've seen evidence of that exact thing occurring, so that, and where there are more members of environmental groups, you actually get fewer projects sort of across space, and we have a different paper that shows that. So I think that phenomenon is real, but I haven't been able to like combine it with this sort of data. What I do know is from interviews and from talking to folks on the ground, that it seems like that happens, right? That seems like, I mean, Santa Barbara is a great example. We just have had a series of fires, and all of a sudden there's this huge proposal to do community, I can't remember what they call it, community clearing, blah, 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 and it's this like mass integrated thing. And as far as I can tell, the enviros are not particularly opposed to it, right? As you might have expected them to. And Santa Barbara has plenty of enviros, so like there's definitely potential. So I've seen it a little bit, but I don't have a way to kind of put those two. I don't have a way to test that directly. I would like to, but it could be that that's what happens, right? Mobilization of could be that I guess that's an alternative mechanism, right? That could be going on here, which is it's not that I get mobilized. It's that you who were preventing this get demobilized, right? That could also be going on. And we see a quick response, so we see a lot of effect in almost time 0 and time 1, like 1 year, within 1 year out, which is a little bit suggestive that these are potentially plans that were in place, kind of, or like ready to go, but maybe had that opposition. So I think I should put that in a footnote.
Thank you very much. Let's pause for coffee.
Coffee.